Today's daf is daf Samach Aleph, and we'll begin in Mirz Hashem, the parak that's called Parak HaKusim, and that is the ninth parak. So the Mishnah here at the beginning of the ninth parak is addressing the question of avodim and noshim. Hakusim, the Mishnah says, that's non-Jews, ein lehem nazirus. There's no parsha of nazirus. There's no kabbalas nazirus. There's no chalos nazirus with regard to a guy. But noshim ba'avodim yesh lehem nazirus. And in the parsha of nazirus, the Torah says ish o isha ki afli lindar neder nozal haz. So isha is explicit in the parsha, and by virtue of an extra phrase in the parsha, it says v'amarta alehem, we derive that an eved is also included in the parsha of nazirus. Obviously, we're talking about an eved Knani. An eved ivri has the status of a Jew l'chol davar, so we don't need a Mishnah to teach me that an eved ivri is makabel nazirus. But in the case of an eved Knani, we need a special drasha because his status is somewhere between that of a non-Jew and that of a Jew. If he's a non-Jew, he doesn't have nazirus. If he's a Jew, he has nazirus. And now the Mishnah is going to compare and contrast the nazirus of noshim to that of avodim. Chomer bin noshim ibavodim. In other words, there's going to be a chumrah with regard to nazirus of noshim that does not have its parallel in the nazirus of avodim. Shehu, the master who owns the eved Knani, kofes avdo, he can force and compel his eved to drink wine. And this is based on the principle called shibud, that an eved is meshubad le'adono. He is, so to speak, owned to some extent by his master. Now the Meiri is quoted here as saying that once the Adon forces his eved to drink wine, then that itself is a bittul of nazirus. He completely nulls and voids the nazirus. And he can do so because the eved is meshubatim. So that in effect, the master has what we call veto power. If the eved Knani takes upon himself nazirus and the Adon says nothing about it, then fine. The Adon has no objection. The nazirus of the eved Knani will be chal, be valid. But nevertheless, the Adon has the veto power. And he can null and void the nazirus of his eved insofar as the eved is meshubatin. Now it seems that this goes on forever and ever, meaning from the moment that the eved accepts nazirus until the moment that the relationship of kinyan kaspo comes to a termination. For that entire period of time, the Adon remains or reserves for himself veto power. That's as far as an eved is concerned. But Vieno kofes ishto. But with regard to a Baal, the Baal has one of two choices. He can, if he so desires, to be mefer haneder. And once he's mefer haneder, then she can drink wine. On the other hand, if he's not mefer haneder, the Mishnah establishes he cannot coerce her to drink wine. Because if the amount of time that is allotted to him to be mefer passes, and he heard about the nazirus of his wife, he was not mefer b'yom shamo, that's called a kiyum of the nazirus, and then for sure he cannot be mefer her nazirus, and certainly he can't be kofer on her to violate her nazirus. So again, the kfir that the Mishnah is talking about is in a situation where the nazirus is bimkomo medus, where it's valid. In the case of the Adon, even though the Nazirus is valid, as we're going to learn from a special drush, but nevertheless he still retains that veto power, and he could force the Eved to be over the Nazirus, and therefore void the Nazirus. But in the case of an Isha, he has two choices. He could either nip it in the bud and be Mefer HaNidarim HaNazirus immediately, B'Yom Shama, when he hears about it. And basically, that's kfir here. In other words, when it says Eno Kofes Ishto, it means he could be Kofes Ishto if he does so on the day that he hears about the Nazirus. And that's because that would constitute a hafara. But if that day goes by and he was Mekayim the Nazirus, then there's no kfir. She's on her own now, and there's nothing he can do to touch her Nazirus and invalidate it. Tani, the Gemara says, Hakusim ein len Nazirus minani mili. So it's really interesting here that the Gemara is seeking a source from which we could derive the conclusion that a guy is outside of the parsha of Nazirus. And the reason for this, and the Havamina here of this question of the Gemara, is because Nazirus is basically a subcategory of Nidarim, and a guy could take a neder. And therefore, we would have thought that if a guy could take a neder, then let him take a neder of Nazirus. Like, for example, we have a halacha principle called Ovdei Kochavim Nodrim Nidarim Unidavos Ki Yisrael. And therefore, since Nazirus is also a neder, then without the following drasha that we're about to learn, we would think that a guy can be Makabel Nazirus, just like he can be Makabel Nidarim. The Tan Rabbana Daber al Bnei Yisrael. The parsha in Bamidbar Vav, in Parshas Naso of Nazir, opens with the words Daber B'nei Yisrael, and that's coming as a miut for Lola Ovdei Kochavim, which means that an Ovdei Kochavim does not have Nazirus. Then it says V'amarta Alehem, and we wonder what those two words are adding. They seem totally superfluous. He already said Daber B'nei Yisrael, so what's V'amarta Alehem? So those extra words are coming for a ribui. And what's that ribui? L'rabos es havadim. So on the one hand, Daber B'nei Yisrael is going to exclude avodim. I'm sorry. On the one hand, Daber B'nei Yisrael is going to exclude Ovdei Kochavim, a regular rank and file guy. But on the other hand, V'amarta Alehem is going to include avodim. So it means that not only are B'nei Yisrael able to be Makabel Nazirus, but even Avodim Knanim, who are not Yisraelim, even they could be Makabel Nazirus. But again, with the caveat, if you will, that the Adon has a right to be Kofa him and in effect to be Mavatal that Nazirus. Now the Gemara wants to know the following. You derive from V'amarta Aleim a ribui of avodim. Lomeli Kro, what do I need a ribui of avodim? Hamer called mitzvah shisha chayeves by Eved chayeva. We have a Gzeira Shava called La, and that teaches us that any mitzvah that women are obligated in, likewise Eved is obligated in. Because in the parsha, at the end of Kitetse of Gerushin, it says "V'kosav la sefer krisus," and with regard to a shivcha, it says at the beginning of Kedoshim, it says "O hufsha lo nitan lo," and the Chacham in Gemara in Chagigat Avdal derive from this Gzeira Shava lo any mitzvah that a woman is obligated in and Eved is obligated in. So why is it that as far as Nazirus, we needed a special ribui to include Avodim and Nazirus? They should be included in Nazirus by virtue of the Gzeira Shava that equates an Eved with an Isha. La. Omarava Shani Hacha. I would have thought in the Havamina that Naziris is different, although the Eved Kanani shares all the other mitzvahs that a woman has, but not in the case of Naziris. The Amakra in the Parsha in Naso, it says, I'm sorry. In the Parsha in Matos of Nidarim, it says, Lesser Israel Nafsha, Misha Nafsha Knuyalo, Yotze Eved, She'ein Nafsha Knuyalo, Behoil, V'ein Nafsha Knuyalo, Emo Legabi Nazir Namilo. What was the Havamina that an Eved would not be included in the Parsha of Nazirus? And the answer is because the Parsha of Nidarim says Lesser Isar al Nafsho, and that comes to exclude an Eved who's not Nafsho, because Nafsho Knuya lo, his Nafsho is Knuya to his Adon. And therefore, I would think that an Eved who's a Nafsho Knuya lo, in other words, he's in the Rishus of his Adon, and that's called Kinyan Kaspo. Therefore, if Hol Ve'ein Nafsho Knuya lo, we would think that he is not included in the Kabbalah's Nazirus. Kamash Malon, that's why we need a special drasha that despite the fact that Ein Nafsho Knuyalo, nevertheless, he could be Makabal on himself Nazirus. Now it's interesting. The pasuk that the Gemara quotes here for the Havamina to exclude an Eved is Lesar Isar Nafsho. That pasuk does not appear in the Parsha Nazirus at all. It appears in the Parsha Nidarim. But the assumption is that we can make a hekesh between the Parsha of Nidarim and the Parsha Nazirus, based on the pasuk Lindor Neder Nazir Lahazir. So we're going to derive from this pasuk conclusions about a Nazir. Fine. So the difference between the Havamina and the Maskana is that in the Havamina, the Kabbalah's Nazirus of the Eved Knani is automatically Batal Umavutal, and the Neder or the Nazirus never gets off the ground to begin with. But in the Maskana, the drasha of Daber B'nai Yisrael, which is going to add the words V'amarta Leim L'Rabos Zavadim, it means that the Eved could accept upon himself the Nazirus, but it still doesn't remove from the Adon his rights to be Kofer, to force the Bittul HaNeder. So it's interesting. We start with Lola, which is an equation between an Eved and an Isha. But at stage 2, we say there's a difference between an Eved and an Isha with regard to Nidarim. A woman can take a Neder because Nafsha Eina Knuya L'Baila, but an Eved cannot take a Neder because it's Nafsha Knuya L'Adono. So therefore, we need a special Ribui and a drasha to teach us that an Eved can in fact accept upon himself Nazirus. I'm just going to change the computer. Sorry. Oh, that's a little bit better for me. Okay, so now we have a drasha to teach us that an Eved can accept upon himself Nazirus, even though Nafsho Knuyel Adonam. Omar Ma, Taber El Bnei Yisrael, V'lo Ovdei Kochav. So the parsha of Nazir is addressed to Bnei Yisrael, but not to Akum. So Gemara asks, V'kol Heichad Eksiv Yisrael, Ovdei Kochav Lo. You have to be consistent. Whenever you see the word Yisrael or Bnei Yisrael in the parsha, you're going to have to exclude Akum. And I'm going to show you that there are other parshas in the Torah where it says Bnei Yisrael, and yet an Akum is not excluded. For Gabi Erchin, or to pronounce it more correctly, Arochin, in that parsha, we don't exclude Ovdei Kochavim. Tichsiv, even though the parsha opens with the words Vayikuchav Zayin Taber Bnei Yisrael, V'Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Bnei Yisrael Ma'arichin, V'yein Ovdei Kochav Ma'arichin. So we're talking about Kabbalah al Atzmo to bring to the Beis HaMikdash his erech, or the erech of somebody else. But a guy cannot accept upon himself erech. So even though a guy is included in Darm and Adavis, he's excluded from erech. So the Brisa wants to know the following. Yachal lo yu nerochin. Maybe we should say that since the parsha opens up with Daber Bnei Yisrael, is lo yehu ovdei kochav nerochin. There's no erech at all, even if, let's say, Bnei Yisrael would accept upon themselves to bring the erech of another person, and let's say that other person is an oved kochavim, so they cannot accept upon themselves to bring erko shel ploni oved kochav. And all this is in the Havamina Yachal. I might think. Talmud Lomar, in the Pasuk Daber El Bnei Yisrael Mart Aleim, it says Ish. It says Ish ki yafli neder bi erkecha nefashos lashem. So in the Pasuk of Erchin it says Ish. And this is coming as a ribui that even Ovdei Kochavim, who cannot be marich, they can't accept upon themselves arochin. But if Yisrael is marich, then he can accept upon himself to bring Erko Shalovi Kochav. And that haracha will be chal, and he'll have to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. So we see that there is an erech tov de kochavim. They can't be marich, enim yichol laharich, but erech they have. So even though it says in the pasuk Bnei Yisrael, and we excluded ovdei kochavim because they're not in the parasha of Arachim to be marich, nevertheless, when it says ish, we derive the conclusion that we include ovdei kochavim, and they are nerachim. So why is it with regard to Naziris we don't say the same thing? He says here, Yesh lemayik mitevos b'nei Yisrael shal v'kom enim yichom lekabel Naziris ulahavi korban ki Yisrael umikol makom yesh lilmod ulerabos mitevas ish Shem kibel ovdei kochav Nazirus tochel Nazirusam v'yasurim lishtos yain ulitov lemesim. Even though they can't bring the korban, and maybe Bnei Yisrael would exclude ovdei kochavim from the korban, just like we said ein marichin. Nevertheless, nerachim. They are included to some extent, halfway measure, in the Parsha of Arachim. So when it says Bnei Yisrael, it's not going to exclude Ovdei Kochavim. You want to use Bnei Yisrael to exclude Ovdei Kochavim from Kabbalah's Nazirus. But we have the Pasuk Ish, and the Pasuk Ish is a ribui, which means that if the Ovdei Kochavim went ahead and he accepted upon himself Nazirus, that Nazirus would be chal, would be valid. And therefore the Nazir would be enjoined from drinking wine or from contact with the dead. So at this point in the Gemara, in the Shakla V'Taya, we're really stuck. Because we have the Ribui of Ish, which we saw in the Parsha of Arachim, and from which we derive the conclusion that if a person is marich, pointing to a guy, and he says, Erko alai, the haracha is chal. So the Gemara answers, Shani Hach and Naziris is different. The Omar Kra, the Pasuk says, Li aviv uli ima lo yitama, v'mi sheyesh lo av, yotzo v'kocham shein lo av. In other words, the guy is excluded from this prohibition of lo yitami li aviv. It's not shaykh to a guy. And therefore, he cannot be Mekabel Nazir Salat, even with regard to Tumah and Shtiyas Yain. So the strange thing here is that on the one hand you have the word ish, on the other hand you have li aviv li ima. Now ish would be a ribui, but then aviv ima is a miyut. So let's understand this mute. What does it mean that Ovi Kuchom Mein Lo Av? Lamai. Ilem L'Nyin Yerusha The Torah gave rights to the son to inherit his father. Shenemar, as it says at the beginning of Sefer Dvarim, Yerusha li'esav nasati is har seir. So that har seir was given to Esav and what it means is that Esav will inherit the land and then he will bequeath the land to his Yarshim. And that always goes through the father. So we see that the Torah recognizes and validates for an Akum and an Av with regard to Yerusha. And the son inherits his father. So you can't say that Ein Lo Av in the case of an Akum is referring to Yerusha. That's impossible. Because a guy inherits his father. Ella says the Gemara, V'mishem muzar al kibud aviv. The Nazirus only applies to someone who is within the bounds of kibud av. And the mitzvah of kibud av was given to Bnei Yisrael and not to Ovdei Kochavim. So a guy doesn't have a father as far as Kibbud Av is concerned. Oops, sorry. So the Gemara asks me, Ksiv Kibbud Av l'gabi Nazir. There's no din of Kibbud Av in the Parsha of Nazirus that we should say, well, only someone who is commanded on Kibbud Av, he could be Makabel himself Nazirus. Why would we derive here any distinction between a Yisrael and a guy? You're just telling me that he's not Mitabi Li'ov Li'ima. Eloma Kra, the Gemara answers, Li'ov Li'ima lo yitama. A Nazir is not permitted to be Mitame, even for the burial of his own father and his mother. The Misha Yeshlo Tuma. The Parsha is talking about Tuma. So in the Parsha of Nazirus, we have a Parsha of Tuma, of a Nazir Shenitma. And now, what we're going to do is, we're going to use the Pasuk Li'ov Li'imo Lo Yitame to teach us that only someone who has a Tuma and is Mitame Li'ov Li'imo. But in the case of a Nazir is not allowed to be Mitame even for V'imo. And that's Misha Yeshlo Tuma. It's the Yisrael who's shaykh to the din of Tumah V'Tara. It doesn't apply to an Akum. Is therefore the Gemara says on the top of Samach Alpha Beis Yotza Akum she'ein lo Tumah.